What is up, my Shadowverse soldiers, and welcome back to another Shadowverse Evolved video. What's up, Shadowverse soldiers? Before we get into the deck breakdown, I want to talk about the new series that I'm thinking of doing. I don't know anything about the Shadowverse lore, and some people that are coming into the game probably don't know that much either. I've just started playing the actual, digital card game, the CCG. I didn't really play it competitively or anything like that. I knew it from the digital game, of course, before when I first started. But to not have a huge yap session, I'm going to be doing a secondary series on this channel, that being the lore and what everything has provided. So if you guys want to figure out what's going on with Shadowverse in the digital, go ahead and check that out. I put that in the link up here on the top right, so go ahead and check that out if you want to. But outside of that, let's go ahead and get inside the video. Alright, and so today's video, we're going to be talking about Amethyst Forest / Fairy Buff or Fairy Token Spam, whatever you guys want to call it. Just know that this deck is now on the market and it's actually pretty strong this set. So before, it seems like most of the cards they kept releasing through set 1 through 5 just kind of felt like cope. And it was like, okay, so Fairy Token Spam got one card, is this really going to be strong enough? But now they got a singular card, a legendary, and it actually makes this deck pretty playable. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll know everything that this deck can provide and all the routes that it can go into, because Grand Showdown is right around the corner, and you sit across from this deck, and then they play a card, and you're like, okay, what in the hell does this card do? And then at that point, that's when you start losing, because it sure has happened to me in the past. Alright, so getting into the pros and cons for Fairy Token Spam. So the pros are, it has strong followers, it has a buff mechanic that makes the followers pretty big, it has combo, and then its offense is pretty good. Alright, so going down the list for the pros, so the strong followers, most of these followers have a really strong fanfare effect, or their activate abilities are just very strong for what they do, and essentially for how much you pay for them, it's going to be feeling good when you play them. In terms of the buff, you have cards in your EX area that your opponent can't really touch, so it's going to feel like a Beauty and the Beast situation, and even if your opponent targets one of the cards, you still have lots of cards to worry about, in the EX area to really keep going with your game plan. Another thing with the combo is, it wouldn't be Forcecraft if it didn't have combo, but the combo effects on this deck is just very good, just because you're able to apply lots of effects after you play 3 cards, and then the 3 cards, or the 2 cards you play before you play a 3rd card, are essentially free if you need them to be. And then the offense, since you're going to be giving a Fairy Storm, then you can swing at them for a whole lot, and if you combo it pretty well with the last tick that we were talking about, you'll be swinging for a lot of damage in one turn. But getting into the cons, so it does take a little bit of setup, it does not have a lot of removal, it really lacks in board wipes, and its defense overall is lacking. Now, what would a good synergy deck be without some sort of setup? So that's the one thing that will just kill any sort of archetype, is trying to set up your game plan, but your opponent says, well, I'm going to play a card, and you're going to have to focus around mine. So it's kind of like a tug of war situation. So that is a con for the deck. It is a setup. It does take a lot of setup for it to work. But it also doesn't have a lot of removal. So one thing about this deck is we are going to be using the combo effect, so we're going to be using cards that just put cards back into your opponent's hand, and that doesn't really get rid of the threat at all times. But there are cards that do get rid of the threat and puts it to the bottom of the deck. But initially, we're going to be going for the combo play so we can get as many cards in our hand as possible to replace the card, but we're just going to be bouncing it back to the hand. And the other thing that the deck has a problem with is board wipes. So if your opponent develops a board, you're going to be in a little tight of a situation, because there's only a handful of cards that can really deal with a board in Forcecraft. So that's one of the things that is very lacking in. And I guess with all the not removal and the board wipes, it does not have a strong defense. So you do have ward followers, that is nice, but your opponent can just use spells to go ahead and get rid of it, and then start swinging at you or develop a board themselves, which, just kind of goes hand in hand with the not a lot of removal and board wipes, and it just feels pretty bad when your opponent just gets rid of everything that you've worked towards, and then they develop something, and then you can't really get that back without just doing the whole game plan again. Alright, so let's talk about Amethyst. So he's a card that came out in set 6, and it really put this deck on the map. So he's a 2-cost 2/2. When you put him into play, you put a Fairy Token into your EX area. You give each Pixie follower in your EX area +1/+1. You can engage them to select up to 2 Pixie followers that cost 1 or less on your field and give them Storm. So it's a pretty nice ability that you're going to be able to choose Fairy Tokens that are 1 or less, because it really matters that we use this Fairy Wisp because they are free and they go to our combo count, which we'll definitely be talking about with the synergy of everything once we get into the game plan of the video. But sure enough, it is very good that this legendary came out in set 6, because this deck is now on the map and it's actually very scary. Alright, so these are some of the ways that you're going to be able to spawn some cards into your EX area and onto the field, and they are in the form of Fairy Circle, a good staple from set 1, Spring Green Protection, Elven Princess Mage, and Spirit Shine. So looking at Fairy Circle, so this has just been a good card since set 1, putting those 3 fairy tokens into your EX area and then setting up for combo 3 if you need them just for 1-cost followers, pretty cheap plays. Spring Green Protection is something you'll definitely have to think about. You do get the free Wisps token in your EX area by bouncing it back to your hand, but it doesn't really feel too good at times, but it is still a card to put a Fairy Wisp into your EX area. We do have the other card that puts Fairy Wisp, Elven Princess Mage, on Evolve, so you get a 4/4 follower and then you get those 2 Fairy Wisps, and then you can start buffing those Wisps into your EX area after that. And then we have the new card Spirit Shine, which is also very good because you're able to choose from 2 abilities. It's a 1-cost spell. You can either select a pixie token on your field or in your EX area. You can give it +2/+2, or you can put 2 fairy tokens in your EX area. So I want to give a nice honorable mention to the lost but not forgotten cards that are able to spawn fairy tokens into either your EX area or onto the field. So we have Sylvan Justice, Fairy Whisperer, and Water Fairy. I think Sylvan Justice is still a little bit of a decent card just because you're able to do 3 damage to a follower and put a fairy token into your EX area in quick timing. Fairy Whisperer is still a decent card for spawning a fairy onto the field and a fairy token onto your EX area. If you're running like Titiana's Sanctuary or something like that, then I'd say this is still a pretty decent card. And then we have Water Fairy. This card is just too slow. Why run this card when we can just run Bellringer, get a card into our hand, and then keep the place going? Alright, so we looked at some pretty good spawners. Now let's talk about our supporting cards. So we have Elf Song, Fairy Dragon, Fairy Torn, and Blessed Fairy Dancer. So looking at the first card, Elf Song, no one really paid attention to this card because fairy token spam was still on a little bit of copium at that time. But it's a 2-cost spell, you're able to summon a fairy token, but when you have combo 3, you give each Forestcraft follower on your field +1/+1. Taking the fact that you're going to be flooding the field with either Fairy Wisp or tokens, giving everybody +1/+1, and then when Amataz does his thing to give him Storm, and if you use other comparing cards with it, you'll be swinging for a lot of damage with those tokens really fast. And then we have Fairy Dragon, a card that came out in set 6. It's very new, so it's a 2-cost, it has Ward. When it comes into play, you give this card +1 attack for each fairy token on your field and in your EX area. And then when he dies, you put a Fairy Wisp and a fairy token into your EX area. Alright, so this card generates a lot of value being on the field, being played, and when it dies too. So it's going to have a minimum of 5 if you have at least 5 cards in your EX area, and then a maximum of 9 if you have both the field and the EX area filled, and then you play Fairy Dragon. So a 9/4 is not that bad, and then even when it does die, you get to put a Fairy Wisp and a Fairy Token into your EX area so you can start buffing cards again. So we do have Fairy Torn, one of the newer cards that came out in set 6, so it's a 1-cost quick spell. You can select up to 2 pixie followers on your field and put them into its owner's EX area. If at least 1 pixie follower was put into the EX area from this ability, you give your leader +2 defense. In certain situations, sometimes the 2 defense does matter, and when they're swinging into one of your followers, that being like Fairy Dragon is something you could definitely choose. They're going to be swinging at Fairy Dragon for a lot of damage. Well, instead of my Fairy Dragon dying, I can just put it back to my hand and then give myself +2 defense so I can play Fairy Dragon again. Truly such a raw example, but if it's something you don't want to do, then don't do that, guys. And then we have the GOAT, Blessed Fairy Dancer. So this card is just too good. It is definitely going to be in every build for this. So if you don't already know what it does, it's going to give +1/+1 to each pixie follower on your field and in your EX area. I remember when I was first playing Shadowverse Evolve for the first time, and I was using Blessed Fairy Dancer incorrectly because I was only giving +1/+1 to followers in the EX area. And then I was like, oh, okay, so it gives to tokens on the field too. And then I actually sat down and read it and looked at it. I was like, oh, this gives it to every pixie follower, not just tokens. So remember that when you're playing the deck. Alright, so some of these honorable mentions are definitely going to be hot takes, and some of them you might just see because people are going to be rocking some crazy sort of like fairy tech in their decks. So these are the honorable mentions for the supporting cards for fairy token spam. So we have Fairy Beast, Titiana's Sanctuary, Greenbrier Elf, and Bolt, King of the Elves. So starting with Fairy Beast is definitely going to be probably a hot take of a card just because you're going to be getting rid of the pixie followers, but they are going to be healing 3 and drawing a card, and that's going to sometimes negate some of the damage you might have done in a turn, or they're just going to be generating value by doing that every turn if you can't remove this card and they keep it upright. It might definitely turn into a situation of a problem, but I don't think you will be running into this card at any time soon. Now, I would say number one on this list for honorable mentions, it would be Titiana's Sanctuary, just because when you put a fairy token onto your field, you can go ahead and give it +1/+1 on top of whatever effects that you're going to be doing with the +1/+1 effects that you'll be doing later on in the game. It just also helps with your game plan of buffing up your fairies. They just get that extra attack, and then they also have a sale. Alright, so we have the new card that came out in set 6, Greenbrier Elf. So he's a 2-cost, 2/3. When he comes into play, you banish a pixie token from your EX area and you look at the top 4 cards of your deck. You may reveal a Forcecraft card from among them and add it to your hand and put the rest of the bottom of your deck in any order. So if you're in a situation where you do Fairy Circle and then you spawn those 3 cards, and then maybe you can go into a Greenbrier Elf turn 2 if your opponent doesn't really have like a scary turn 2, which sometimes most decks don't. So you can go into Greenbrier Elf and go ahead and start looking at the top 4 for any Forcecraft card that you might need, and you go ahead and pick that up. And then lastly, we have Bolt, King of the Elves, which this would definitely be a good card all around for the deck. It's just that this card is just so darn expensive. So you pay 4 for him. You can either choose one of the following to select a Pixie Follower in your field and give it +2/+2, or you can 2 search your deck for a Pixie Follower and reveal it and then add it to your hand. Yeah, he has like really nice abilities. It's just the 4 cost really just kills this card. So it's nice and all that we're going to be swinging for storm damage with our tokens and whatnot, but we'll also need some other storm followers that will really close off the game or really put a dent in our opponent's life points. So the 2 cards we'll definitely be looking at is Sukuna the Brave and the Small and Rhino Roach. I think more people will be looking towards Sukuna just because of the combo 5 to make this card a 5/5 with Storm. It's just not too bad, but there are some situations where you might be using Rhino Roach to go ahead and just have the X attack. Your opponent doesn't have any play points up, so you're like, okay, I'm not really afraid of what you're going to do. But honestly, Sukuna just has the good stat lines of dealing like the 5 damage and having the 5 defense, and you won't be sweating as hard if you use Sukuna. Alright, so these are the helpful cards that are going to be helping out the deck. These are definitely going to be helpful staples. We have Rose Gardener, Fashionista Nekla, and then we have Spinaria, Keeper of the Enigmas. So Rose Gardener is definitely going to help with combo 3, of course, to just be drawing a card to replace a card, and if your opponent plays like a pretty scary card, or just something late game that you don't have any damage since you don't have lots of removal in this deck, this is going to be your good spot on removal to just put it back to their hand, so you can go ahead and start being aggressive again. Alright, so looking at the next card, Fashionista Nekla, so I think this card does what Bolt King wanted to do, essentially, but now it's on a combo 3 effect. So I think it's really good if you use this card and then bounce it back to your hand and then use it again and buff a fairy and then give it Storm. So you'll be swinging for a lot of damage in one turn that your opponent, doesn't have the play points to have a response to, or if they do, then, it feels pretty bad that you did all that. But you need to force the play in some sort of way, but you can be very active when using this card. And then lastly, looking at Spinaria, this is definitely going to be a staple, a 3 of, I would say, personally for me, but you just get to look at the top 4 for a Forcecraft spell and a Forcecraft follower and put them to your hand. And then you also get the nice ability of combo 3 to recover 3 play points. So this card costed 2, you pay 2 to essentially get 2 cards to your hand. And then if you already have the fairy tokens, which you probably did with the 2 fairy wish that you played for free, then you played Spinaria, and then you're able to play Amataz right after that since you get those 3 play points back. Alright, so not a lot of removal, or these removals are pretty expensive because you're going to be committing plays to them. The only one that probably synergizes with the deck very well is Archer, but looking at them going down, we have Crystalia Lily to just go ahead and put something to the bottom of your deck. We have Ivy Spellbomb to deal 5 damage to something, and then, if you combo that well with the Fairy Wisp, you get to deal 3 damage to its leader, so it's not too bad. But then we have Archer, which is just really good because we're going to be playing a whole bunch of cards in our turn, and essentially this card has some sort of like ward effect, essentially, because your opponent's going to be playing cards too, but you're also going to be playing cards, and then you're also going to be dealing damage at the same time, so they're going to really focus on this card when they're able to. I do want to give a helpful reminder that anyone that is going to be going up against this deck, or going to be, playing this deck, is that when Archer does evolve, she is definitely in surefire bullet range because her stats do not change. I believe she still becomes a 1/4 when she's evolved. She's just able to choose 2 targets instead of 1 to deal 1 damage to. But just be mindful of that whenever you play up against an Archer or you're playing Archer. And if you want to catch your opponent off and they evolve Archer just to deal 2 damage to multiple cards, then go ahead and surefire bullet it. But if not, I would still suggest to keep this unevolved for as long as you can, so your opponent has a harder time removing this card. Alrighty, so let's get into the game plan when playing the Fairy Token Span, Amataz Forest, whatever you want to call this deck. Let's go ahead and get into this game plan. Alright, so it seems like a straightforward plan. You play the fairies into your EX area, you buff them up as much as you can with Blessed Fairy Dancer or with Amataz when you do play him, or whatever you need to do. Try as much as you can to buff up these fairies so when you do play them, they have Storm. But we really want to set up combo 3 nicely, so we definitely want to get Fairy Wisps into our EX area so they're free, so they can set up the 2 Fairy Wisps with Elven Princess Mage, which is just a good card to evolve and then swing into a follower in response to them, you know, swinging at you. It's a nice 4/4, so it's a pretty good body. So we set up with a Fairy Wisp for combos, and then we try our best to buff up our fairies in our EX area with Blessed Fairy Dancer, or means of other things like Fashionista and stuff like that. So it's a pretty solid game plan of buffing up fairies and then playing in them and getting combo effects and then swinging for Storm. So I want to go ahead and apologize. I didn't really include any late game options that would be included in this version of Forestcraft. I just can't really think of anything that'll really benefit this deck too much, but if you guys have any like suggestions that'll make this deck stronger in the late game, I know we have like board wipes like Cassiopeia and stuff like that, but I just don't think that's what we're trying to do in this deck. It's just, you know, wipe our opponent's board, because, you know, spending 5 in one turn, you know, outside of Spinaria just to the combo 3 to get the 3 play points back doesn't seem worthwhile. But yeah, if you guys have some really good, you know, late game options for this deck, go ahead and drop them down in the comments below. Let me know, you know, inform me. I'm not a huge Forestcraft player, but I do delve every now and then, so just let me know. Alright, but getting into the tech of things, I think these are some pretty good options to think about for sure when going up against different decks. So I think Path of Purgatory does deal 3 damage to yourself, but you are able to just have a board wipe on command, and if your opponent deals with this at any point in time, then, you know, they really essentially wasted a card, but at the same time, you know, they didn't get their board wipe, so, you know, it's one of those one-on-one things. But, you know, you play this card on turn 3, you know, I don't think you're really doing anything too crazy on turn 3 if your opponent's not very super active, or they're really pushing your face in a lot harder than, you know, you're pushing their face in. I don't think this is just a bad card to include in there to go ahead and start drawing cards and then start setting up your game plan for the rest of the game. I do want to know, also pairing this card up with Fairy Torrent actually feels pretty good, just because, you know, you deal 3 damage to yourself and then you put a Fixie follower back and then you know, heal that 2 back. So we have Bellringer, just not a bad card all around, just always a staple, I would say, to just slow your opponent's game plan down. You know, you can evolve her, ping 2 to a follower, just take the 2 damage, and then ward her up, and then your opponent has to deal with her. Just pray that you're not going up against Havencraft and it gets banished, but, you know, in most situations, she'll just be killed and you draw a card. And then if you're really having a problem with that aggro situation or something like that, so what I'd say whenever teching in cards, I'd say, you know, watch what your locals plays or watch what your people are thinking or saying. You know, like, is Swordcraft really the meta right now, or is, you know, this card the meta, or will this really help? It's just something to tech in if you're having a problem, because there are decks that are definitely faster than you. So I'd say Angelic Snipe is not that bad of a card to think about. And if you guys have any tech options that I am missing here, because like I said, I am not a huge Forestcraft player, not a huge delver into things, but I am going to be picking up the deck and I'm super excited to play it and have it on my hands. But if you guys have any other tech options that I might be missing, let me know down below in the comments. Alrighty, and we are finally at that section of the breakdown where we get into the grade of the deck. But before that, you should already know that we're going to be looking at a sample deck list that I made, a little template of the deck, and let's go ahead and look at that now. Alright, so here's the deck. This is not a bad template, but like I said, it is just a default template just to go ahead and figure out what this deck does. You know, when you get some good playtesting in, you can definitely change the numbers around and the ratios or what cards that you might be including, but I think this is what the deck has in total as like what it does, just for fairy token spam and whatnot, and then good removal with other things in Storm. So I think paired up everything, this is everything that I've chosen. So whenever you play this deck, good luck with your games, but let's go ahead and get back into the grading of the deck. Alright, so we're back into the grade of things. So I am very confused on what I wanted to grade this deck, because I didn't want to give it too low of a grade, because before in the past I really put this deck in like C tier. It was like pretty bad. It was just coping, just like kind of like Runecraft was, but at the same time Runecraft had like spells to like really prolong the game and really stop your opponent, and while this deck didn't really have that, it just, you know, you played your tokens out and you buffed them, and it just felt really bad once you got your stuff removed. But now we're in a situation where we do have our stuff buffed up. We don't have to wait our turn for it to be played. You know, there were situations before in the past where I was able to get a follower to a 6/6 and then, you know, able to play them and then swing for like 12 damage if I was able to put both those followers up there for free. So I think this deck is pretty solid and strong right now. But all in total, the deck is really lacking some removal, so it would be pretty nice if you had removal like added into what you're already doing for your game plan. So I personally would give this deck a solid B+, A- if I would. I don't know, it's just like a little bit between that. You're able to get some really good storm effects, but the buffing does really slow the game down, if anything. You can really do some nice combo effects, which is nice, but your whole game plan is focusing on getting those tokens on the field and then giving them storm, swinging with them, and sometimes, you know, putting those tokens on the field gives you access to doing the combo 3, and that helps with providing with what you want to do later on in those turns if you have the play points. But in terms of what your opponent's going to be doing, if their game plan's like better, like let's say, you know, you're going against your Mad Counter Dragoncraft, and their game plan or a point ahead of you, and they're able to wipe your board, and it's like, okay, so well, what do I do now? I have to start from, you know, C1 all over again in like turn 5, which, you know, sometimes this might not be that bad because you have Fairy Circle to go ahead and start things, or Elven Princess Mage. But there are situations where you can get stuck after you've already done your game plan, and you're like, okay, well, what do I do now? But alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching. You don't know how much it means that you watch this content. Like I said before in the beginning, that I'm thinking of that secondary series of doing the lore videos. I probably might just do it anyways, what you guys vote on it, whether yes or no. But I want to know if you guys are interested in it, and, you know, let's see what the Shadowverse lore really, you know, impacts and stuff like that. How do these cards have a story behind them? Like, you know, what does Sakuna does? Or, you know, what's the story behind Arisa, Erica, you know, all the leaders that we play and represent whenever we do play games. But yeah, like I said, little reminder, I'm going to have a poll for that this weekend, so go ahead and vote. I'm going to be throwing it around on Facebook, all my socials and stuff like that, so let me know, guys. But alright guys, that is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you're safe whatever you do tonight, and safe whatever you do for the rest of the year. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.
Yeah. TRINN, just to get you away. What I got to do, what I got to do, just to get you away. What I got to do, what I got